de neurodesarrollo. Les cuento a nuestros invitados internacionales que el Hospital San Roque de Gonet está ubicado en una localidad suburbana que queda en la ciudad de La Plata y en Buenos Aires, ¿sí? Que es la provincia más grande que tiene la Argentina. Es un hospital que es gratuito y público, es decir, que todas las personas que se atienden acá lo hacen libremente. Y nosotros tenemos un área de neurodesarrollo en donde evaluamos y seguimos niños y niñas justamente entre 0 y 14 años, según los problemas que se presenten. Antes que nada, quiero agradecer profundamente la gran generosidad de nuestros disertantes, tanto Simon, Tony y Alexia, que la verdad es que hasta último momento estuvieron conectándose con nosotros y trabajando por este encuentro. Y también quiero agradecer a los directivos del hospital y a nuestros compañeros y compañeras del servicio y a Juan Pablo, nuestro jefe. Por una cuestión de organización, ustedes van a ver que todos los micrófonos y los videos van a estar inactivados. Eso es justamente, la idea es para que no haya interferencias. En el momento de las preguntas lo que pueden hacer es enviarlas por mail a un chat que les vamos a dejar, un correo que les vamos a dejar en el chat. Les aclaramos que esta actividad se está transmitiendo por el canal de YouTube en su idioma original, es el canal del Hospital San Roque, de docencia del Hospital San Roque de Gonet, y que posteriormente en el transcurso del día vamos a subirlo con la traducción. Para activar la traducción al español lo que tienen que hacer es clic en el icono que dice interpretación, eligiendo la opción español. Esto es importante para que puedan escucharlo y escuchar la traducción, ¿no es cierto? Vamos a iniciar, le voy a pasar la palabra al director del hospital que va a hacer un breve saludo.
Buenos días a todos y a todas. En nombre de la dirección del hospital, mi nombre es Juan Ignacio Tiato, yo soy director asociado. En nombre del resto de mis compañeros de la dirección y compañeras, quiero agradecerle profundamente a los participantes, en especial al prestigioso panel de expertos que tenemos presentes en esta mañana, y no olvidar de agradecer también al servicio de docencia, que sé que me consta que con mucho esfuerzo han logrado que esta jornada se pueda realizar. Bienvenidos a todos, y le voy a pasar la palabra al jefe del servicio de docencia e investigación, el doctor Juan Pablo Bonars, quien va a hacer la presentación de los disertantes.
Bueno, buenos días a todos. Voy a ser muy breve, así podemos aprovechar la expertise y la gran cantidad de conocimiento que nos van a dar nuestros prestigiosos invitados. Más que nada yo quiero agradecer al servicio de docencia, puntualmente, aunque no le guste, a Tomás, y también dejar un agradecimiento para alguien que es también el alma mater de esta traducción, la doctora Bericat, y a Clara Canzani va a ser nuestra traductora, que con mucha colaboración y con mucha paciencia nos ha ido guiando en todo esto. Lo mío se termina, yo estoy súper orgulloso de lo que ha logrado este equipo, así que por favor tratemos de disfrutar lo que es lo que corresponde. Muchas gracias.
Tenemos también como participantes a diversas personas que son justamente papás y familiares de personas que son autistas, así que le voy a pasar la palabra para los saludos a Rodolfo Geloso, que nos va a decir los saludos iniciales.
Buenos días a todos. En primer lugar, agradecer al Servicio de Docencia, Investigación y Capacitación del Hospital San Roque Gonet y a Tomás por la invitación. La verdad que es un gran placer poder participar de esta conferencia internacional. Por cierto, la segunda vez que podemos contar con la participación del doctor Simon Baron Cohen y el doctor Tony Atwood, y la verdad que es un saludo inmenso para darles y presentar a la Liga Asperger 7, a la cual estoy representando en este momento, que es una organización de adultos Asperger con más de 6 años de trabajo y que, bueno, hemos conseguido la personería jurídica ahora hace muy poquitos días. Y bueno, para llevar adelante un poco los objetivos que venimos teniendo desde ese tiempo, que es la concientización del síndrome de Asperger y más que nada sus características, porque a veces se conoce la palabra Asperger, pero no sus características. Y querer seguir brindando la contención a adultos y a su entorno, ¿no? De familiares, laboral, amigos, sociales. Y para eso hemos tenido y seguimos teniendo reuniones y un servidor en Discord que hace las veces de conexión para todo aquel que bueno, desee sumarse. Ya con más de 400 personas adultas Asperger hemos trabajado mucho en la pandemia, más que nada, para la contención y poder suplir todo esto. Así que bueno, a las organizaciones, y aprovechando un poco lo internacional de esta conferencia, a las organizaciones de adultos Asperger que estén en el mundo y quieran contactarse con nosotros, nos pueden mandar un mail a liga.asperger.7@gmail.com o si no por WhatsApp al +5411 2763 7071. Bueno, un poquito para
Bueno,
presentarnos.
gracias,
Muchísimas
Rodolfo.
gracias.
Bueno,
Gracias.
gracias. Bueno, y por último, y pedimos también que sea muy, muy breve, a Horacio Joffre Galibert, también de APADEA, un saludo inicial, y así ya arrancamos con la conferencia.
Muchísimas gracias a la organización. Soy Horacio Joffre Galibert. Bueno, soy papá de una persona adulta, Ignacio, de 38 años de edad, con autismo severo, fundador de la Asociación Argentina de Padres de Autistas y de ALAFE, la Federación Latinoamericana de Autismo, un fraternal realmente y afectuosísimo saludos a Simon y a Tony. Alexia nuestra la vemos acá siempre, así que es de nosotros. Y lo habíamos escuchado en Europa con nuestro amigo Ángel Riviera ya por los 90, y quiero expresarle en nombre de todas las organizaciones que representamos lo que significan ambos, tanto Simon como Tony, científica y humanamente para las familias y para las personas con autismo. Hoy realmente será un placer oírlos acá en nuestra casa, en la Argentina. Muchísimas gracias.
Ahora sí le vamos a pasar la palabra a la primera de las disertantes. Bueno, Alexia Ratazzi, todos acá en Argentina la conocemos, pero bueno, Alexia es psiquiatra infanto-juvenil, es cofundadora y directora ejecutiva de Panacea. Bueno, muchas gracias, Alexia, te cedemos la palabra.
Muchísimas gracias. Buen día a todo el mundo. Veo que hay un montón de personas ya conectadas. Muchas gracias al Hospital de Gonet, a Agustina, a Tomás, a todo el equipo por hacer esto posible hoy. Yo voy a ser muy breve, no voy a pasar los 10 minutos, lo prometí. Y lo que quiero hacer es, en realidad, un poquito, primero, decir que para mí es un inmenso honor estar hoy compartiendo pantalla acá con Simon y con Tony. No solo porque los admiro mucho a ambos desde hace muchos años, y cuando digo muchos años, aunque parezco joven, estoy hablando de hace 20, al menos, años, sino porque han marcado los dos significativamente mi camino en lo que hace al campo del autismo, ¿sí? Los dos son referentes absolutos. Y ayer, tratando de hacer un poco de memoria, sabía que hoy era esta charla, primero me encontré, yo hice la residencia en psiquiatría infanto-juvenil, en un hospital público también de Buenos Aires, y me tocó formarme como autodidacta. En ese momento no se hablaba mucho de autismo en el hospital, y lo que tuve mucha suerte de que sabía hablar inglés, entonces me empecé a comprar libros. Y ahí es donde, desde un primer momento, me encontré con los libros de Simon, por un lado, de Tony, por otro, y de muchos otros referentes. Tanto es así que en mi biblioteca ayer, mientras buscaba y buscaba, tengo 5 libros, miren, tengo acá para darles un ejemplo, por ejemplo. Tony Atwood, ¿sí? Simon tengo muchos, en realidad, este es el cortito, Pero habría, y lo primero que quiero contar un poco de esta historia, porque habría esto ayer, este libro, y quiero volver a un año, que es el año 2008. Tengo anotado, Cambridge 2008, ¿sí? Donde tuve la inmensa oportunidad de ir a rotar durante 3 meses a Cambridge, al Autism Research Center, al Centro de Investigación en Autismo, con Simon, que para mí era estar directamente en Disneyland. Me encanta decir eso porque realmente era Disneyland. Ya a esa altura el autismo me apasionaba, me quería aprender absolutamente todo, y esa rotación de 3 meses tuvo una enorme influencia en mí. La verdad que participé en proyectos de investigación, traduje, no sé, cosas, herramientas de pesquisa en ese entonces que estaban desarrollando ahí. Fue un aprendizaje continuo. Y para darles solo un ejemplo de algo que marcó mucho el camino, es la primera vez donde me encontré con la palabra condición. ¿Por qué? Porque Simon hablaba de condición en vez de trastorno. Tal es así la influencia de esa palabra condición, que en el 2011, cuando creamos Panacea, en el estatuto Panacea, el nombre Panacea, programa argentino para niños, adolescentes y adultos con condición del espectro autista, el nombre de la organización, que ahora lleva 10 años ya de existencia formal en este país, se llama Panacea y no Panatea. ¿Por qué? Porque hace referencia a las condiciones del espectro autista y no a los trastornos del espectro autista, y estamos hablando de 10 años atrás. Y esto fue gracias a Simon y haber escuchado de que empezaba a hablar de la palabra condición, y sabemos hoy por hoy que la palabra condición tiene una connotación mucho menos negativa, porque es un conjunto de características inherentes a una persona y no un trastorno, que enseguida uno piensa en patología, en algo que está mal. Y esto es algo que queremos cambiar. También mencionar que en ese mismo año, ese 2008, tuve la oportunidad de ir a un meeting que se organizó en Londres, gracias a Simon y todo su equipo, que se llamaba Talent and Autism, Talento y Autismo, donde de vuelta ahí conocí a todas las personas que había leído, ¿no? Estaba Uta Fritz y Francesca Japé, y Temple Grandin, con quien hablaba en la cola del café, y Daryl Treffert, y Andy Schneider, digamos, una serie de personas muy importantes que para mí era como estar de vuelta en un lugar donde no podía creer lo que estaba escuchando y viendo, y cómo en ese meeting en el 2008 se ponía el foco en el talento, y no siempre en el déficit. Después, la historia en relación tuve la oportunidad con Simon, y siempre esto es algo que lo quiero decir, de participar en algunas entrevistas que Simon hacía a personas adultas dentro de lo que era el marco de la clínica CLASS en Cambridge, ¿sí? Que lo que hacían era evaluar y hacer diagnóstico en adultos. Y siempre me llamó poderosamente la atención la amabilidad de Simon a la hora del trato y su respeto máximo por las personas. Y esto para mí siempre fue un enorme aprendizaje que me marcó profundamente en lo que es mi actualidad hasta el día de hoy. Bueno, ¿y qué decir con respecto a Tony? Tony, todos sabemos, esa guía que les mostré recién, este libro, ¿qué digo siempre cuando hablo con las familias? Digo, acá, este es el libro gordo de Petete, es la Biblia. Si hay alguien con síndrome de Asperger, este es el libro que tienen que leer. ¿Sí o sí? Siempre, ¿eh? Y esto por suerte está editado, está en castellano. Este es el libro que hay que leer. No solo esto, sino que, a ver, si algunos conocerán esto también, cuando hablamos de pesquisa y de diagnóstico en síndrome de Asperger, algunos habrán escuchado la escala australiana, ¿sí? La famosa escala australiana del síndrome de Asperger. Bueno, aquí tienen a la persona, ¿por qué australiana? Porque Tony es australiano, y por eso se llamaba la escala australiana. Entonces, aquí tiene a la persona también que se hizo cargo de mucho que tiene que ver con el diagnóstico y la pesquisa. Y hoy por hoy, Tony es un gran referente en lo que es diagnóstico en adultos, temas asociados a salud mental. Y una cosa, ahora estoy muy, muy interesada, Tony ha hecho mucho tema de mujeres y adultas, y justo ahora estoy muy, muy entusiasmada porque acabo de descubrir a un cuestionario, una escala en realidad, que deriva de un cuestionario de niñas, pero que lo han adaptado para ser utilizado en adultas, ¿sí? Y Tony es uno de los autores de ese instrumento y creo que es muy importante porque también es un tema que tenemos mucho por hacer, ¿no? Mujeres, autismo, pesquisa, tener herramientas validadas y en castellano, así que estamos en ese emprendimiento en este momento de tratar de tener una validación al castellano o tener en castellano esa herramienta tan importante que Tony está desarrollando. Así que con esto termino, me trae al día de hoy esto, me parece que es tan importante que hoy se hable de temas tan fundamentales y tan en boga como es la neurodiversidad como paradigma, ¿sí? La neurodivergencia, la importancia de que haya clínicos e investigadores que tengan esta mirada, ¿no? No del paradigma patológico, sino que tengan una mirada basada en la neurodiversidad, que significa la diferencia entre mentes humanas, y esto dignifica enormemente, y también de la importancia enorme de lo que se llama investigación participativa basada en la comunidad. Los investigadores y los clínicos tenemos que empezar a escuchar a las personas en primera persona, los testimonios. Ellos son los que tienen que setear la agenda, ellos son los que tienen que diseñar las investigaciones, ellos son los que tienen que decidir qué se investiga, cómo se investiga. Son las personas adentro del espectro del autismo. Y hoy es justamente un ejemplo de ello. Esta charla hoy es posible por Tomás Corrons, ¿sí? Por una persona que está sentadita ahí a la derecha. Tomás Corrons es una persona dentro del espectro autista, es quien hizo posible hoy, gracias a su persistencia, a sus ideas, ¿sí? A su participación en ese equipo, él hoy hace posible que todos hoy estemos aquí y tengamos el enorme lujo y posibilidad de escuchar tanto a Simon como a Tony compartirnos lo que están haciendo. Con eso me pido.
Ay, bueno, Alexia, hermosas las palabras, la verdad, yo me emocioné por lo menos. Bueno, nada que agregar. Ahora vamos a empezar con la charla de Simon, que lo iba a presentar, pero la realidad es que ya no hace falta, me parece. De todas formas, bueno, para ponerle un poco de formalidad, decimos que bueno, Simon es director del Centro de Investigación en Autismo del Departamento de Psiquiatría de la Universidad de Cambridge. Así que bueno, gracias Simon, te cedemos la palabra.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. So that's the first step. Let's see if the technology works. So here we are. And if I go to presenter mode, can you see my first slide, my title? Looks good. Okay, thank you. So first of all, I want to say a big thank you to the organizers of this event. And particularly to Alexia for that very warm introduction to both Tony and me. I was able to switch to the translation, so I heard some of it. And it's a real pleasure to be on the panel with Tony. Tony and I go way back, almost 40 years, yes, in autism research, when we did our PhDs together in London. So here we are. Not much has changed, right, Tony? I'm going to talk about autism research just to give a quick snapshot. My talk is just 20 minutes. That's what I've been asked to do. And talk about neurodiversity. And actually, there has been quite a shift in the culture around autism and autism research. So let's get started. First of all, to remind you, what is autism? So it's defined as, diagnosed on the basis of social and communication difficulties. But these are also children and adults who have difficulties adjusting to unexpected change. They can get very stressed. if things don't go according to plan. They're said to have obsessions, but I prefer the word narrow interests. Obsession sounds a bit pathological. And Alexia was talking about how we need to be careful about our language, not to inadvertently stigmatize qualities that autistic people have. They also like repetition or predictability. And most recently, the American Psychiatric Association added sensory hypersensitivity as part of the diagnosis. There's also a whole discussion about whether we talk about autism as a disorder, the way the Americans ask us to do. Alexia talked about whether we should call it a condition. I've suggested in a recent article that we should acknowledge the 4 Ds. So difference is all about neurodiversity. And I'm going to elaborate on how we can measure this. Disability, I think, is inevitably part of why someone seeks a diagnosis. And I think the words disorder and disease should only be used carefully. So there are some symptoms in autism that would qualify as diseases, like epilepsy or gastrointestinal pain. They're causing suffering. And the distinction between disorder and disease is where the mechanism is known. But many of the characteristics of autism, I think, can be understood in terms of difference and disability. Let me just make sure I'm not missing a slide, because when we see autistic people, we often also hear that they have multiple diagnoses. I've already mentioned some of these medical ones like epilepsy or gastrointestinal pain. But here you can see, according to recent prevalence estimates, about a quarter also have learning difficulties. Maybe only a tiny percentage, 5%, are minimally verbal. We used to think it was higher, but maybe other neurodevelopmental conditions like dyspraxia, ADHD, language delay seems to be still quite common, about 50%. And at the bottom of this list, you can see poor mental health. So high levels of anxiety and depression. So Alexia also mentioned the importance of recognizing autism in females. And this study from 2019, not from our group, but I think it's very interesting, not only documents that autism is diagnosed more often in males, that's shown in blue, but also later in females, that when females, girls or women are getting their diagnosis, it tends to be later than in males. And some interpret this as evidence that in females, there is greater camouflaging or masking of their autism. Perhaps this reflects greater stigma or discrimination around autism in females, that maybe many cultures, perhaps true also in Argentina, many cultures expect females to be sociable and to have good communication skills. So maybe there's greater pressure on girls to hide their autism until it becomes no longer possible to hide it. Let's talk about genetics, because we now know that autism is not only genetic, but many of the genes for autism have been identified. So this list comes from a website called Safari-Gene, where every new genetic finding is listed on this website. And the list includes rare genetic variants. So that's to say they don't occur very often in the general population, but mutations, deletions, duplications do occur more frequently in autistic people. And you can see over 100 of these rare genetic variants have been found, most of them, as you'd expect, expressed in the brain. But what we should keep in mind is that these rare genetic variants are only seen in about 5 or 10% of autistic people. So although autism is genetic, the genetics of autism aren't captured by the rare genetic mutations. The majority of autistic people don't show these. In contrast, genetic research is now looking at common genetic variants. So they're called polymorphisms, or genes that come in different varieties that we all carry. And what you're looking at is what's called a Manhattan plot. When you do something called a genome-wide association study, it's a Manhattan plot because the graph resembles the skyline of Manhattan. Along the base, the x-axis or the horizontal axis is all the human chromosomes. Each of these little dots is a genetic variant. And if they cross the red line, then they're showing a statistically significant association with autism. You can see in this study, 28,000 autistic people took part. It's a study from the States. Only 5 little dots crossed the line. But these are showing that common genes that we all carry may occur more often in autistic people. And so the new genetic research is looking at genes we all carry that might be in combination, increasing the likelihood that you end up with a diagnosis of autism. Sorry, I'm just going back, trying to. Good. So we've covered common genetic variants, and what I want to do next, that's good, is to talk about how can we measure neurodiversity, and we'll start at the cognitive level. One way to look at neurodiversity, this idea that there are many ways in which the brain can develop, is to look at language development. And this chart, I really like it because it shows that when children are acquiring language, they acquire their vocabulary at very different rates. So some children are acquiring vocabulary very quickly, that's the top pink line. Some much more slowly, that's the purple line. If you looked at the average or the median, that's the green one. But each of these dots is a child tracked across development. And what you see, I think it strikes you very clearly, is that what is typical is variation, that diversity is part of language development. So if you have a child down here who's got very few words, even by the age of 2 years old or 2.5 years old, that's still part of diversity in the population. So that's one way to capture neurodiversity. And we shouldn't judge individuals according to which track they're on as better or worse. They're simply different. And that's one of the principles of neurodiversity. A second way to measure neurodiversity is to look at empathy. We've used a questionnaire called the empathy quotient, and we used it in 600,000 people online. So a big population, typical individuals, and then 36,000 autistic individuals. So very big data. And again, what you see straight away is diversity. So what we are showing in these different colors is typical females over here, scoring higher than typical males in the population on empathy, and then autistic males and females scoring significantly lower. But again, what we see is diversity. And we've also used a questionnaire in that same big population study, which measures systemizing. How interested are you in systems of one kind or another? Again, the bell curves demonstrate diversity in the population. Now what we're seeing amongst this big population is that typical males score higher than typical females, and autistic people score even higher than non-autistic people in terms of the strength of interest in systems. Systems might be music, it might be mathematics, it might be computers, it might be collecting things. A system is anything that follows rules. And autistic people have a strong preference for information that is rule governed. And if you look at the difference between your score on the EQ, the empathy quotient, and your score on the SQ, the systemizing quotient, and plot it, again, what we're seeing is diversity. So each dot is a person. The yellow ones are women in the population. The green ones are men in the population. And the purple and pink ones are autistic males and females. They're clustered very differently in this space. And again, we should just respect and accept that this is part of diversity in any population. So if we look at some examples of what I mean by systemizing, this is an autistic man, but here he's shown as a child. Max Park lives in California. He's autistic, but he's also the #1 champion in the Rubik Cube competitions internationally. And he's been fascinated, some would say obsessed, with the Rubik Cube ever since he was a child. The Rubik Cube is a nice example of a system because it follows rules and very specific kinds of rules, if and then logic. If the top right-hand corner is blue and I rotate it by 90 degrees, then the top left-hand corner will become green. So you're following an if and then logic. Sorry, I'm losing control on the screen. And what's interesting is that when we looked at that large population and divided the general population into those working in STEM, science, technology, engineering, or maths, and those who do not work in STEM, we found those working in STEM, on average, have more autistic traits. So we're seeing a link between aptitude in pattern recognition, in understanding systems that follow these if and then rules, and the number of autistic traits you have in the population. So a link between something very positive, as Alexia was saying, that autism isn't, it does include disability, but it also includes differences, some of which are strengths or even talents. What about measuring neurodiversity at the biological level? Well, we were able to work with a company called 23andMe, which is a personal genomics company. And what we could do here was, in those individuals who took the systemizing quotient, the SQ, we could look at which common genetic variants are associated with your ability to systemize. And then we looked at whether there was any overlap with the common genetic variants associated with autism, and found there was a significant correlation. So the genes for autism don't just involve those rare genetic mutations, as we talked about. They also involve genes that are very common in the population and which predispose an individual to excellent attention to detail, excellent pattern recognition, and understanding systems. Another biological factor that demonstrates neurodiversity, or that's associated with neurodiversity, are the prenatal sex steroid hormones like testosterone and estrogen. In our studies, we've been able to measure these during pregnancy and found that women who have elevated levels of testosterone and estrogen during pregnancy, sampled in the amniotic fluid, sorry, it's jumping around, that surrounds the baby in the womb. I'm not sure what the problem is technically, but let's keep going. That those babies who are later diagnosed as autistic had higher levels of the prenatal sex steroid hormones, both androgens like testosterone and estrogens, which are hormonally linked because testosterone is converted to estrogen through the action of an enzyme called aromatase. So what you'll notice when we look at these hormones, again, is diversity. Males in the population, on average, have more of this hormone than females. The hormone changes brain development, but look at the range, that's diversity. Autistic people are shifted slightly higher, but again, look at the range. We need to just acknowledge that diversity is the norm in not only cognition, but also in biology. And if we go to the number of neurons in the brain, another way to visualize diversity, post-mortem studies looking at the typical female brain, the typical male brain, and then the autistic brain show on average differences in the number of neurons. Women in the population on average have a smaller number of neurons. It's about 19 billion. Males on average have a slightly higher number. It's 22 billion. But studies from University of California at San Diego by Eric Courchain and colleagues are showing that the autistic brain, if you count neurons or nerve cells, have 65% more neurons than the non-autistic or typical brain. We don't know whether more neurons is an advantage or a disadvantage. It's just a difference. You can imagine it might correlate with picking up more detail in the world, picking up more sensory information. It could lead to sensory hypersensitivity. It could lead to information overload in certain conditions. But either way, what we're seeing is diversity. So let's just finish with this idea about neurodiversity and the quote from this autistic professor, Temple Grandin, that Alexia mentioned earlier. The idea is that in nature, diversity is the norm. Not all animals, not all plants are the same. The same is true with humans, and it's true about the human brain, that we are all different. It doesn't mean that someone, because they're different, is lesser or inferior. They're simply different. This is a poster that's used by the autism community to raise awareness about autism, and where the autism community are asking for two very simple things: acceptance and respect. And that's really what the research is also finding. We're finding difference, and we should respect those differences and accept them. I want to finish on mental health research and more real-world research, because I've spent a lot of time talking about basic science, because our work has revealed that there are very high rates of suicidal thoughts, suicidal feelings, suicidal plans, and attempts as a reflection of high rates of depression in autistic adults. And this should be a wake-up call to governments, to health providers, and to social services that autistic people are not getting the right support and are not feeling included in society. Depression and poor mental health are not part of autism. It's not what you're born with if you have the genetic predisposition to autism, but it's probably a reflection of insufficient support. And we need to increase the amount of funding and the quality of services for autistic people at every age across the lifespan. And one example is in the field of employment. In my country, the UK, it's estimated that 85% of autistic adults are unemployed. And we know that unemployment is bad for your mental health. It makes you feel excluded. This is an example of a company called Auticon that now operates in many different countries and who only hire autistic people. They particularly are looking for autistic people who have good coding skills or pattern recognition skills so that they can work hired out as consultants, hence the name of the company Auticon, Autistic Consultants, to any organization that needs them. But we need many more employers to change their recruitment practices, their hiring practices, and their support for autistic employees once autistic people find a job, so that autistic people can enjoy the same human right as everyone else, which is the right to employment. I'm going to stop in the interest of time and thank both our team, our funders, and there's a link to our website at the bottom there for anyone who wants information about the studies that I've been talking about. Thank you.
Bueno, muy interesante, hermosa la disertación. Muchas gracias, Simon. Después, al final, nos gustaría hacer alguna breve pregunta. Sabemos que tenemos poquito tiempo, pero tenemos algunas preguntas, aunque sea una. Bueno, ahora sí, le vamos a pasar entonces la palabra a Tony Atwood. Tony es doctor de la Universidad de Londres y es profesor asociado de la Universidad de Griffith en Queensland, y además todo lo que ya nos contó Alexia. Así que bueno, sin perder más tiempo, le dejamos que comience con su presentación.
Okay, thank you. Well, Simon, great to see you again. It's been a while. I hope we can meet up again sometime soon. As you say, it goes back with Uta and a whole crowd of people that have moved on. We ought to have a reunion at some stage to explore where we've gone when we were students together. I applaud and endorse what you said there. In fact, some of the things I will be amplifying to a certain extent in this one. So what I'm going to go through here, if I can, with this, is expanding knowledge about autism. This is really for Argentina. And if you're looking at developing your services, then yes, you will get knowledge and wisdom from research, but you'll also get it from clinicians. And this is the part that needs to be recognized, from personal experience of autistic individuals. That is a huge wealth of knowledge on depression. Some are able to cope and manage and reduce their depression. How did they do that? How did you succeed? All those sorts of things. We need to explore that further. So what I would suggest is looking at the establishment of an autism department or course at a local university, like ARC at Cambridge, so that you have an opportunity to develop people's expertise at graduate and postgraduate level, so that you can have a center of excellence in conducting research that may be designed for Argentinian needs in particular. Now, I would also suggest that you might consider, and that is for clinics and clinicians to be able to specialize in autism spectrum disorders. If you are a generalist, you don't get the opportunity to develop the expertise. It'll take you hundreds of years to do that. So if you can arrange for specialist clinics, I think this will be a good component. Now, what I'm going to focus on is knowledge base within autistic individuals to become mentors at school. So when that autistic child goes to a high school, they are connected to somebody in grade 11 and 12 who's also autistic, who can support them, guide them, protect them, and so on. They can be a mentor for them in so many ways, knowing that they understand. It's also at universities. There are now opportunities to meet fellow students in senior years to help you there and in work environments. But I'm also finding that there are autistic teachers, therapists, psychologists, and psychiatrists. Yes, I know we tend to think of, shall we say, information technology and so on, but also in the caring professions. And sometimes an autistic individual can be a superb teacher of autistic children. They understand it, and therapists and psychologists and psychiatrists. So we need to broaden the recognition that you will have such individuals already in Argentina. Also, to have focus groups to identify what are the local cultural issues that may be not necessarily unique to Argentina, but a bit of a priority. What do we need to do? You also need to look at television documentaries on autism for public support. I think that's going to be important. So if you've got any good links with journalists, TV producers, documentaries, and so on, but it'll also help if the public is aware with funding from politicians. But also facilitating support groups. And this is something we've found has flourished in the UK and in Australia. These are groups of parents who may campaign for schools, for example, but we're now finding that this may be in areas like eating disorders or relationships, and they are able to support each other in a variety of ways. I would also suggest, because we recognize the association between autism and eating disorders, gender dysphoria, alcohol and drug dependency, and so on, that this should be recognized by those services. And people coming in are automatically screened for autism, because you need to adjust the therapy programs, the residential programs, the group programs to become autism friendly. Now, I'm going to use one study. It came out last year by Laura Crane and others at University College London. It was a fascinating one, but it's something for you to consider for Argentina. Now, this was a 10-week autistic-led program, and I think that was one of the most important things. Program to help autistic adults learn more about autism within a peer group context. This was linking in to that wisdom, the wise elders of the tribal culture of autism, who can give advice that has authenticity and credibility that many autistic individuals feel that they need. Now, it was after the diagnosis. Yep, it's great you got the diagnosis, but where to from here? I've got it, I know it. I can now look back at my past through the lens of autism. I can look for the future. But how is it going to be different, and who's going to help me? So the advantages of peer support, actually, over professional support includes greater empathy of really knowing, greater hope from seeing peers with the same diagnosis, both successfully navigating the neurotypical world and achieving, because they're in some ways the best to indicate what can be done, and also a greater understanding of autism and the diversity in autism. In the 50-odd years I've been exploring autism, I've never known two autistic people the same, even identical twins. The variation is really quite extraordinary. Now, the title of the program was Exploring Being Autistic, and developed by an autistic consultant and trainer. You probably have someone in Argentina who may be able to do this. Now, it was evaluated by a team of researchers at University College London, which is where Simon and I had our PhDs all those years ago. 9 and 7 participants in each of 2 programs, and there were 10 sessions in each. These were the 10 topics. Introduction, overview of content, and sharing autism histories. This is very important, to feel that you're not alone. In autism, one of the reasons for depression is you feel alone. Nobody understands, nobody gets me. I know a lot of teenagers and young adults feel this way, but this is very genuine. Who does understand me? And at last, you're with a group of people. You're now in the majority. Now, the diagnosis, session 2, what it means for you in the initial feelings about autism is the label limiting or liberating, and disclosure in different contexts. If I'm applying for a job, should I disclose? How will I disclose? Is it good for me? Not good for me. Will I disclose to my grandparents, to my physician, to my next door neighbors, who, and some people are very cautious and conservative about broadcasting who they are. Others have a big t-shirt, autism and proud, and they go about it. That's their personality in a particular way. So there are many different components. Third one was on social communication and theory of mind. This is very much Simon's area, because he was in the forefront of developing theory of mind all those years ago, which is now actually having a resurgence. But it's the ability to communicate with us. Now, you have a speech therapist, you have an occupational therapist, but not a social therapist. There aren't a group of people who have done postgraduate training in assessing and developing communication skills, and that's needed. However, there are a number of programs often developed in the United States, the PEERS program, for example, on teaching a range of social skills. Sometimes we use drama teachers, drama therapists, a whole range of, shall we say, approaches to practice and rehearse social interaction, which is going to be important. So improving social communication, which goes through locating and moderating emotions. Some of the new research on interoception and exteroception here is going to be very, very important in terms of aspects of alexithymia, empathy, social connection, all those sorts of things. They are very, very important areas. And one of the things that I've known from autistic individuals I've worked with, and my own family members on the spectrum, is can have sometimes a sixth sense ability to pick up someone's feelings. And when you ask them, how did you know that? It's actually correct. This is in real life. How did you do that? Often they'll say, I don't know, but I just did. And so that needs to be explored a lot further. So we also look at sensory issues very much clinically. And a lot of autistic individuals say, please take this seriously. It is painful. Repeated exposure does not reduce the sensitivity. I live in constant fear. What I know as a clinician is that anxiety and sensory sensitivity go together. If you're anxious, you're more sensory sensitive. Then more sensory sensitive, you're more anxious. So those characteristics are going to occur. And how do you cope with it? I find quite often adults learn to tolerate it and avoid it. For the circumstances, I will endure it. But it's as bad now when I'm 65 as when I was 5 years old. And I still haven't worked out how to alleviate that. And that's something I hope, when Simon was talking about the proliferation of neurons and neuronal connectivity, this may be a feature there. Executive dysfunction, as my dear mother would say, couldn't organize getting drunk in a brewery. May have an IQ off the charts, but they couldn't sort out organizing, planning, or all those sorts of things. And often what occurs is mum is the executive secretary that does a lot of the work for the individual, who's very reluctant to leave mum because mum's so good at it. Why should I learn it when she will do it all for me? So also attention and disparate ability profiles. This is one of the things where you have attention shifting, special interests, all sorts of things. On the one hand, an autistic individual, you appreciate and go, wow, that's amazing. How did you do that? And then other occasions you go, wow, I think the only thing you can say consistently on IQ tests is variability. The scale scores are very rarely all at the same level. You have talents and you have deficits. And understanding the attention, ADHD, because what we're finding now is it's rare to have autism pure. It's nearly always autism plus anxiety disorder, depression, ADHD, learning disorders, etc. And sometimes the anxiety and depression is of far greater concern in their daily life than the autism itself. The prognosis for autism pure is good. If you've got autism plus anxiety, depression, ADHD, prognosis is not so good. Flexibility, as Simon was saying, dealing with change, transitions, routines, perfectionism, fear of making a mistake, and so on. But here, anxiety, depression, and mental health are very important, and the link between autism and mental health. The autistic individual has, I think, both environmental and constitutional and genetic reasons why these are going to be significant. A higher level of anxiety and depression in family members, that may have been inherited, but a lot like sensory sensitivity, bullying and teasing, and trauma from some of the incidents that they've occurred. So sometimes my concern isn't autism, it's neurotypicals and what they will do to the autistic individual in terms of bullying, teasing, rejection, humiliation. Session 10, where to from here? To a certain extent, consolidation, autism and the law is going to be important for some, planning for the future. Now, what were the motivations for attending? Exploration of autism generally and in relation to themselves. We now have a number of books in English, often published by Jessica Kingsley publishers, helping a child, teenager, or adult learn about autism in themselves. It's something they really do need to know, and empowerment and to be accepted. So if we look at camouflaging, I say be a first-rate autie, not a second-rate neurotypical. Be true to yourself. A lot of work on self-identity. Who are you? How are you going to explain yourself to others? Don't want to change you, but you need to learn to explain yourself to others. I'm the sort of person who tends to look away when you're talking. I'm not being rude. It helps me concentrate on what you're saying. I like talking about drain covers, but I'm not good at reading signs of boredom. If I'm boring you, please tell me and I'll stop. I won't be offended. And I'm looking to meet other like-minded women with a late diagnosis who have struggled for most of their lives without knowing why. Yeah, with Michelle Garnett and I, we have a Wednesday clinic. And the vast majority are autistic women who are recognizing through their children, the media, and a whole range of things that I'm different. I've camouflaged it. And actually, often after the confirmation of the diagnosis, often the need to camouflage significantly diminishes, which is very good for mental health in a variety of ways. To meet other people like me, to feel less isolated, and to explore the positive aspects of autism, and to develop practical and coping strategies. You have that in Argentina. That is a reserve that you need to tap into, to learn from one another, and to help to work through mixed emotions and navigating challenging experiences. So I think, hang on, oh no, there was an evaluation of the program, appreciation of the autistic-led nature. Yes, there are autistic individuals who can do this. You've got to choose them very carefully, not to resolve their own issues. They have reached a level of maturity. The 7 stages of autism, they then come back, as Temple does, to support others. A feeling of a shared and safe space, because the individuals there aren't going to bully and tease you. Lessening of judgment. An autistic facilitator was more qualified than a neurotypical person to lead such a course. Self-criticism is a major problem in autism. Sometimes the worst criticism comes from the person themselves, than teachers, parents, I'm not good enough, and so on. And the facilitator had a very positive view of what it is to be autistic. Theme 2, unity in diversity, which we've been hearing about from Simon earlier, to recognize that diversity. I like the fact that it is mixed. I like the fact that it's male and female, a mix of ages. That can be very useful. If you had 10 people like me in a room, we wouldn't learn anything. And participants were at very different stages in their diagnostic journey. And what I'm finding, I've got a PhD student at the moment who is exploring aging from, I say aging, they're the same age as me. They're going back through how things have been over time. For some, it's been a very good journey, successful. For others, not. And we need to explore more about what's going on, but overwhelmingly reported a sense of belonging. Theme 3, positive practical outlook, made a real difference in day-to-day life, new knowledge, acceptance. And that's what Simon was talking about earlier. Acceptance, because often in autism, there's a fear of rejection, often coupled with increased self-awareness. I've kind of done less masking. and practical solutions combating mental health problems, particularly anxiety and sensory issues. So that's my bit.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Tony. La verdad, muy útil para nosotros la información, y bueno, vamos a tener que ponernos a trabajar al respecto, todos los que trabajamos en el área. Así que bueno, si les parece, no los queremos retener demasiado tiempo, pero nos gustaría por lo menos hacerle una pregunta a cada uno, y después vemos, ¿sí? Bueno, ya que lo tenemos a Tony ahí a mano, le vamos a hacer una pregunta a él. Tony, ¿te parece que es necesario que el modelo médico hegemónico o el paradigma patológico siga siendo quien valide el diagnóstico de las personas que tienen condiciones del espectro autista? ¿O te parece que las personas deberían poder autodiagnosticarse sin la necesidad de recurrir a los profesionales de la salud?
I am not sure how I'm going to answer that question, because it's an important one. There are certain autistic individuals who are disabled. They have high support needs, and they need to be recognized and access those services. The diagnostic criteria tend to be American-based, and that's based on medical insurance companies considering that the condition is severe enough to warrant them spending money on that individuals. And certainly there are individuals who warrant that. I have a personal view that unfortunately, historically, autism was captured by psychiatrists. And they see it very much in a psychiatric model, which is a condition that is to be corrected, shall we say, rather than accepted, embraced, and used. But there are dimensions, as I say, of autism that I wish I had a means of removing sensory sensitivity, for example. So it's a very difficult one to answer. A lot of people that I see now with the internet have self-diagnosed, often accurately, and then say, why wasn't this picked up earlier? If I know this is me, and I've been to all these professionals before, and none of them see it, and then I go on the internet, fill in the AQ, and I score 38. That's pretty obvious that I'm probably on the spectrum. Why hasn't anybody picked it up before? And the point of diagnosis is self-understanding. So for some that I see, the point of the diagnosis isn't necessarily to access funding or services. It's self-understanding. Okay.
Muchas gracias, muchas gracias. Le voy a hacer una pregunta a Simon. Simon, ¿cómo te parece que los clínicos e investigadores deberían posicionarse en su trabajo diario ante el cambio de paradigma? Es decir, ante el nuevo paradigma de la llamada neurodiversidad.
So it's a very good question. It's part of what I alluded to at the beginning, which is the changing culture in which we understand autism. And I think what we should be aiming at is collaboration between different types of experts. So clinicians, researchers, and people with lived experience, as Tony said, whether they're autistic or whether they have an autistic person in their family. We need true collaboration in all areas that are to do with autistic people's lives. So whether it's research where we're studying autism, we need autistic people involved in the research, in the research teams, not just as participants who we study, but people who are co-designing the studies. The same is true for services, that clinicians shouldn't sit separately to say, we think this is an ideal service. We should have autistic people and their families co-designing those services. And, you know, I think another way to think about this question about neurodiversity, how is it changing the way we act, is in terms of maximizing participation for autistic people. That what we've realized is that, like many minorities, they've been historically excluded. They've been talked about, but they haven't been included in the conversation. And, you know, I think we need to always be striving to maximize inclusion. I gave the example of the workplace, but we could equally look at educational settings, shopping, going to the supermarket, going to the dentist. Every aspect of our society has to be accessible to people who are diverse, and that includes autistic people.
Yeah.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Muy productivo, muy interesante también la respuesta. Bueno, nada, no queremos abusar más de su amabilidad. Nuevamente les agradecemos, pero infinitamente, la participación, tanto a Simon, a Tony, a Alexia también. Y para cerrarlo vamos a dejar a Tommy decir unas palabras, a Tomás Corrons, nuestro compañero, decir unas palabras de cierre.
Well, thank you. Small closing statement. This time I decided not to play a big role in this event. It's not that I became more timid. On the contrary, thanks a lot, I have evolved. You can't picture yourself. I mean, you don't have the idea of how much you have helped me, both Simon and Tony. Both from the work that you have done and also your personal experiences. I have drawn a lot from your personal experiences, and the way in which you help us, I mean, people who have the condition, I would say it's unmeasurable. So I would like to thank you from a personal perspective for everything you do, and for always being open to my crazy ideas. I know that sometimes I may be a little bit insistent and persistent, but really, everything you do has helped me a lot, and I believe that somehow, as I said, as I think I said before, you have helped me become what I am right now. I think it's important that we do research right now. When we talked before, I was jobless, I was unemployed, I have to say that. Now I was hired by this research center. And I think it's important that we do research. And I believe it would be worthwhile if we could do something together, let's say small, tiny at the very beginning, with you both and Alexia. So I hope that we can stay in touch to see if it is viable to produce something during the next upcoming months. And well, I count on your mentoring and tutoring to do things well. So I don't know whether you want to say something, Simon, Tony, and we close the event.
All I can say is good luck. We are leading something that has a momentum, and people are, should we say, increasing that momentum, and through that you will achieve. You will also be able to look at other countries and not make their mistakes. So you have an advantage in a variety of ways.
Yeah, and I'll just add my voice to what Tony's just said, but to thank you as the organizers for creating this opportunity for us to have the dialogue. Both Tony and I think I can speak for him too, we're available. You know, reach out to us. I think it's part of illustrating what we were talking about, that the new culture of doing autism research, creating autism services, thinking about the place of autistic people in society has to be through dialogue, through mutual respect. And so please reach out to us.
Yeah.
Thank you, Simon. Well, we'll stay in touch with you and Tony. I also want to thank Jane Asher, who was following. So that's it. I believe that we can close here. Thanks also to Rodolfo Peloso and Horacio Joffre, and all the guests, all the attendees that have joined the conference. Well, thank you, Simon and Tony, and let's stay in touch.
We shall indeed. Okay. Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Simon. Bye.